At Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law laughed and said, "How does it feel to be a loser?" Everyone laughed so hard, except me. Then I also asked her, "How does it feel to know you will lose your job tomorrow?" At the moment I said those words, everyone immediately kept quiet. What happened next shocked everyone. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Sam Yalley from New York. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. My name's Gerald, and I've been many things in my life. Son, husband, father, but above all, I've been quiet. Not weak, not oblivious, just quiet. I let people talk while I listened. I let them believe they were the ones in control. That's how I built 3 businesses, sold 2, and kept one hidden behind layers of shell companies and silent partnerships. People think they know you when they see what you let them see. And for years, I let my family see a version of me that was gentle, tired, perhaps even harmless. Maybe I thought that if I played the humble father role well enough, I'd earn their love. But Christmas night changed that forever. It was the annual dinner, formal as always. The kind where we dressed up even if we weren't going anywhere afterward. My wife, Miriam, insisted on decorum. The table was set for 12, although only 8 ever showed up. My eldest son, Raymond, came in late, as usual, with Bianca draped on his arm like a red-lipped trophy. She had that laugh, shrill, rehearsed, sharp. It always came seconds too late or too early, just enough to make people uncomfortable, but too polite to call it out. I sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey while they all passed wine and stories in judgment, thinly disguised as jokes. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and the serving of honey-glazed ham, Bianca looked at me, right at me, and said with that gleeful malice in her voice, "So, Gerald, how does it feel to be a loser?" It was so casual, like a tease between friends. Everyone burst out laughing. Even Miriam chuckled nervously, covering her mouth with her napkin like it might absorb the disrespect. But I didn't laugh. Not because I didn't get the joke, but because I was too busy swallowing the familiar lump of humiliation that had lived in my throat since Raymond married her. I looked around the table. No one met my eyes. They just kept laughing, sipping their wine, talking over each other. That's when I leaned forward and said, calmly, "How does it feel to know you'll lose your job tomorrow?" The room fell silent. The clink of a fork dropping to a plate echoed like thunder. Bianca blinked twice, frozen, then tilted her head and smirked. "A loser with guts," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. She didn't believe me. Why would she? In her world, I was just a retired old man in a knit sweater who got bossed around by his wife and quietly wrote checks for family vacations. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned the very company she worked for. Not directly, of course. That would have been too obvious. I had created a shell company years ago, one that gradually bought up controlling shares in her firm. I kept the operation distant, faceless, so I could watch from the shadows. When Bianca was hired, thanks to Raymond's connection to the then CEO, I let it happen. I let her ride the corporate perks, the house, the SUV, the quarterly bonuses. And I watched her talk down to HR staff, expense luxury dinners under fake client meetings, and mock the same leadership that signed her checks, my checks. That night, after dinner, I sat alone in my study. Miriam had gone to bed. The house was quiet except for the faint tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I stared at my phone. No missed calls, no texts. Not from Raymond. Not even a weak apology. I opened my laptop and made a single call to the firm's HR director. I gave her the go-ahead. The documentation was already there. Everything we needed to terminate Bianca with cause. Make it effective tomorrow morning, I said. Strip all assets. Benefits included. My voice was steady, almost bored. I felt nothing. Or maybe I felt everything and had simply learned how to numb it. It's a strange thing, the moment you decide you've had enough. It doesn't come with fireworks or fury. It comes quietly, like a tide that's been rising for years until it finally spills over. I had been quiet for too long. Too many holidays spent being dismissed, too many rooms where I was treated like wallpaper. My son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I once kissed, had chosen a woman who treated me like a punchline, and I had allowed it. Until now. That night, as I watched the fire in the hearth crackle and die, I thought about legacy. Not money or assets. Those were secured. I thought about dignity. About what kind of man I wanted to be remembered as. If I couldn't be loved, I'd settle for being respected. And if not respected, then at least not mocked in my own home. Tomorrow, the game would change. Bianca would wake up to a very different reality. And so would Raymond. I closed my laptop, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dark room for a moment longer. The silence felt heavy, but clean, like the pause before a storm. I wasn't the loser anymore. I was the man who had finally remembered his power. Morning came with a gray sky and the kind of cold that crept under the skin, the kind that made everything feel sharper. I was already dressed by 6. Coffee in hand, I stood by the bay window of the living room, watching the bare trees sway in the wind. The house was quiet, too quiet for a morning after a family gathering, but that suited me just fine. I didn't expect Bianca or Raymond to call, and they didn't. The silence wasn't accidental, it was pride. They assumed I had made a dramatic threat and would now stew in regret. They didn't know that the wheels were already in motion, and that this time, I wasn't bluffing. At 8:07 a.m., my phone buzzed with a single message from the HR director. Termination completed. Asset retrieval team is on site. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before replying. Proceed as planned. Confirm when all benefits are terminated. There was no satisfaction in pressing send, just certainty. I had reached a point in my life where protecting my peace mattered more than pretending for appearances. My silence had been mistaken for submission. They'd learn now what quiet resolve could really do. Across town, Bianca was most likely pulling into the company lot in her company-issued Range Rover, sipping a $7 coffee, and planning her usual Tuesday. Bully a junior associate, skip a meeting, expense a manicure. She never knew I sat on every board meeting through a proxy, that every complaint about her behavior had found its way to my desk. Her arrogance had given her confidence, but not cover. It had made her forget the very foundation she stood on was mine. And now, I was pulling it from under her, brick by entitled brick. By 8:42 a.m., the call started. First it was the office number, then her direct line, then Raymond's number flashing across the screen. I didn't answer any of them. I just watched as the missed calls climbed. 12, 26, 41. At 9:15, a flurry of text messages poured in. What did you do? She's been fired. Is this your idea of a joke? Call me now. But I didn't. Because I was done explaining myself to people who thought I owed them obedience just because we shared a last name. That kind of control dies hard, but once dead, it never returns. By the time I answered, I had 78 missed calls, half from Raymond, the rest from numbers I didn't recognize. I knew they were scrambling. The house was company-owned, and the lease agreement required vacating within 48 hours of employment termination. The car? Already being towed. The cards? Frozen. Bianca had built her life around an illusion of status she hadn't earned. I had gifted her comfort, reluctantly, for my son's sake, and she'd turned it into a pedestal to mock me from. So I pulled the pedestal. Finally, Raymond growled when I picked up. What the hell did you do? I did what needed to be done, I said. My voice was calm, controlled. His wasn't. You humiliated her, our family. You're tearing everything apart because of one stupid comment at dinner. One comment? I said, my tone sharpening. This isn't about one comment. It's about years of disrespect. Years of watching you let your wife treat your father like a fool while you sat by smiling. He hesitated. I could hear him breathing, his voice shaking. You're overreacting. You don't destroy someone's life over pride. No, son, I said, letting the final word land heavy with irony. I reclaimed mine. There was a pause, then, if you don't fix this, you've lost a son. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and said, then I guess I've lost one. The line went dead, and with it, a part of me. I won't lie, it hurt. I raised that boy. I remembered his crooked smile when he was 7 and obsessed with dinosaurs. I remembered his first heartbreak, the night he cried on my shoulder, the college acceptance letter we celebrated with pizza and root beer floats. But that boy had vanished. In his place was a man who let love become transactional, who forgot what it meant to protect family with honor. I couldn't reach him anymore, and maybe that was my fault. I spent the afternoon reading. Every time I looked up from the pages, I felt the silence. But it wasn't the kind that aches, it was the kind that heals. For once, the walls of my house didn't echo with judgment or tension. Miriam said nothing. She moved around the kitchen quietly, glancing at me with something that wasn't quite approval, but it wasn't anger either. Maybe she understood more than she let on. That evening, I took a walk around the neighborhood. The leaves were brittle underfoot, the sun hanging low and tired in the sky. I passed a neighbor who nodded, then looked at me twice like something had changed. Maybe it had. Maybe I walked straighter, breathed deeper. Maybe the weight I carried wasn't shame anymore. It was clarity. By the time I returned home, the streetlight in front of my driveway had flickered on. I paused under it, staring at the house. It looked the same, but something inside had shifted. There was no going back from this. The cracks had split wide open, and there would be no patching them. I had drawn a line in the sand, and for once, I was standing on the right side of it. Inside, I poured a glass of scotch and stood by the fire again. I thought of Bianca's smug smile at dinner, the way she delivered her insult with glee, certain of her invincibility. And I thought of the silence that followed my reply, the way the room turned cold. She had underestimated me. They all had. That was their mistake. Mine was thinking I could endure forever without breaking. But I had broken. And in the breaking, I had found something solid underneath. Something like a spine. It didn't start with Christmas. It started months ago, maybe even years, though I didn't fully realize it then. That slow shift from tolerance to resentment, from family gatherings to carefully endured performances. I used to tell myself it was all part of being a father, bearing the weight so your children didn't have to. I convinced myself that my silence was noble, that biting my tongue was an act of grace. But in truth, it was cowardice. And the day I stopped lying to myself was the day the trap began to take shape. It was late spring when the idea first took root. I had just returned from a board meeting at one of my quieter holdings, a mid-sized consultancy firm tucked under the umbrella of Whitestone Partners, a shell corporation I built in my early 50s. It was clean, profitable, and most importantly, discreet. A safe distance from my public image. I kept it as a silent investment, trusting the executive team and collecting quarterly reports. But on that day, one of the partners casually mentioned a new hire, someone brought in through influence. A referral from upstairs, he said, flipping through a file. Name's Bianca Royce. Been here 6 months. Thinks she's the next COO. I remember the way my pulse slowed. I didn't react outwardly. Just nodded, as if her name didn't hit like a slap. I took the folder when he offered it, pretending I needed to review the budget. But when I returned to my office, I read every page. Her file, her evaluations, complaints, flagged expenses, incident reports. The woman I had welcomed into my home had been abusing her role from the start. I saw unauthorized travel claims, client gifts with no justification, unexplained reimbursements for luxury dinners and spa treatments, all charged to departments she wasn't even assigned to. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. It didn't take much digging. She was arrogant, yes, but sloppy, and I now had evidence. At first, I sat on it. I told myself I didn't want to start a war. But every family dinner made the silence harder to maintain. Every little snide comment she threw across the table, every eye roll, every time Raymond parroted her opinions and dismissed mine as old school or out of touch, it all chipped away at me. I would come home from those dinners and sit in my office, staring at her file on my laptop, my hand hovering over the send button. All it would take was one email to HR. But I didn't pull the trigger, not yet. I wasn't ready. I still hoped Raymond would see her clearly, would step in and draw a line. But he didn't. And eventually, I stopped waiting. Over the next few months, I began documenting everything. I had my assistant discreetly request copies of her financials, cross-checking her expense reports with company policy. I found patterns. Her misuse wasn't occasional. It was habitual. She treated the company like a personal piggy bank. When I discovered she was living in a corporate leased house in Fairmont Hills, one of our most expensive assets, I nearly laughed. She had made a palace out of a loan, and she thought the king who funded it was asleep at the gate. I sent an anonymous tip to the internal audit team. Just enough to prompt a routine investigation, nothing too loud. The goal wasn't scandal, it was precision. I wanted her vulnerable, not victimized. She responded just as I expected, defensive, deflecting blame, intimidating junior staff into silence. She thought she was invincible. She thought her connection to Raymond was enough to shield her. She didn't know the shield was paper thin, and I was holding the match. The moment I knew there was no turning back came in early December. I was at their house, her house, technically, watching Raymond stumble through a story about how he might need help funding a new investment. Bianca says we should just ask Dad, he laughed. He'll cave like always. I stood there, half smiling, while my own son reduced me to a backup plan. That night, I went home and drafted her termination letter myself. I wrote it like a stranger would. Formal, concise, merciless. It was clinical, yet strangely personal. I included every violation, every breach of policy, every ignored warning. I attached it to an email and scheduled it to send on December 26th, 8 a.m. sharp. I didn't tell Miriam. She'd never have stopped me, but she would have asked me if it was worth it. And I wasn't ready to answer that. Not yet. Because even then, I wasn't sure what I wanted more, vindication or peace. But I knew one thing. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep watching them dine at my table while biting the hand that fed them. So I built a trap. Slow, silent, perfect. And then I waited. By the time Christmas rolled around, I knew the end was near. I watched her that night as she laughed at her own joke, surrounded by the people she thought she owned. She wasn't laughing anymore when I replied. And that silence, the one that followed my words, wasn't confusion. It was fear. For the first time, she saw me. Not as a father-in-law, not as an aging man in a cardigan, but as the man who could take everything from her with a single sentence. And I did. I had no regrets. Not because I was proud, but because I was honest. I didn't destroy her life. I just reminded her who built it. The morning after Christmas always carried a strange kind of quiet. The decorations still clung to the walls. The leftover wine sat half-finished on kitchen counters, but the energy had shifted. Most years, that silence felt peaceful, like a sigh after a long breath. But not this time. That morning, it felt like the calm before a collapse. I was already dressed by the time the sun came up. Coffee brewed, coat on, eyes fixed on the news, though I wasn't reading a single word. I knew what was coming. Or more accurately, I knew what she was waking up to. Bianca had no idea her life had been reduced to a countdown. At 8 a.m., her access badge would fail at the company's front door. Her email login would be deactivated. By 8:10, she'd be pulled into a conference room where the HR director, whom she often belittled, would hand her a termination letter. She wouldn't be offered the chance to resign. There would be no negotiation, no second chances. All corporate assets would be retrieved that same day. Her housing and transportation benefits were revoked effective immediately. It wasn't personal on paper, but to her, it would feel like war. At 8:17 a.m., my phone lit up. No name, just a number I recognized from the corporate office. I didn't answer. I just waited. 5 minutes later, another call. Then 2 more. Then a voicemail. I knew she'd try to contact me, try to lean on the very connection she spent years mocking. And as I watched the screen flood with her increasingly desperate attempts, I sipped my coffee like it was just another Tuesday. By 8:42 a.m., the tone shifted. My inbox lit up with messages from Raymond. First confused, then angry. She says she was fired. What's going on? Did you know about this? And then, inevitably, accusatory. You planned this. Tell me you didn't. He had no idea. That was the part that still stung. My own son, so deep under her thumb, he couldn't see past her version of the truth. He didn't ask if she was guilty. He didn't ask what she had done. He asked how I could do this to her, as if loyalty to her now superseded the years I spent raising him. Meanwhile, Bianca was unraveling. She called Miriam first. likely thinking she could appeal to a softer touch. My wife, bless her, passed me the phone and walked away. Bianca's voice was breathless, frantic. Gerald, listen, there's been a mistake. I showed up and my keycard, my car, my house. I've been terminated. Fired. You need to fix this. I didn't say a word at first. I let her fill the space with panic. They said the order came from the top. Gerald, I have nowhere to go. This can't be legal. I'll sue. You can try, I said flatly. Her voice broke. You did this. I just stopped protecting you. There was a pause. Then came the venom. You think you've won? This was a mistake. You'll regret this. No, I said calmly. I've regretted every year I let you humiliate me under my own roof. This is just correction. She hung up. The rest of the day unfolded exactly as planned. The company retrieved the vehicle by noon. A property manager arrived at her home with a 48-hour notice. Her work laptop was remotely wiped. She was effectively exiled from the very world she had climbed into by proxy, mine. And the speed with which it all came crashing down was not an accident. It was the product of precision, of months of planning, of every inch of patience I had left being stretched until it snapped. Raymond came to the house around 6. I saw his car pull into the driveway from the study window, parked crooked like he couldn't see straight. When I opened the door, he was red-faced, breathing hard like he'd run a mile. He didn't greet me. He just stood there, fists clenched at his sides. Why, he asked. Not angry, not even confused, just broken. She had every opportunity to act with integrity. I said. She didn't. You embarrassed her. You destroyed everything. No, Raymond. She did. I just stopped shielding her from the consequences. She's my wife. And I'm your father. That used to mean something. He took a shaky step forward. Fix it, or you lose me. I looked him in the eyes and saw a boy I didn't recognize anymore. Then go, I said, each word deliberate. I won't beg for a place in your life anymore. He stared at me like he was waiting for me to crack, to soften. But I didn't. And after a long moment, he turned and walked away. That night, I sat alone in the living room. No fire, no lights, just the hum of silence. I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I expected regret. I didn't feel that either. What I felt was release. A weight, years in the making, had lifted. I had always been the one who held the family together, who wrote the checks, made the calls, fixed the messes. But that role had quietly turned me into a doormat, a relic. I had allowed people to stand on my shoulders without once demanding they remember who held them up. Now, they remembered. It didn't take long for the rest of the family to hear. Gossip moves faster when it has shock attached to it, and by the second day, I was getting text messages from cousins I hadn't seen in years, each one cloaked in faux concern. Heard something wild, everything okay? Not my business, but is it true? And from those closest to me, my brother Kenneth, my niece Layla, even Miriam's sister, came the more direct jabs. Gerald, you're tearing your family apart. But none of them had been at that dinner. None of them had heard the bite in Bianca's voice, or seen the way my son looked through me as if I were the help. Their sympathy was performative, and their loyalty was shallow. Still, it stung. Raymond hadn't called since he stormed out. Instead, he took to other avenues. On the third day after Bianca's termination, I got a call from the head of PR at one of my subsidiaries. Sir, you should know, there's some noise online. I didn't understand at first, until she sent me a link. Bianca had gone public, not with specifics, but with sentiment. A vague post on LinkedIn about being silenced by power, about abuse of influence in corporate structures, followed by a flurry of sympathy comments from strangers and passive-aggressive likes from extended family. She never mentioned my name, but the timing was transparent. And the message was clear. She wanted to shape the narrative before I could. I sat back in my chair and read the post again. It was theatrical, manipulative, and effective. She knew how to present herself as a victim. She always had. And now she was doing it on a broader stage, playing on emotion and implication. What people didn't know, what they weren't supposed to know, was the documented trail of misconduct, the way she bullied interns and took kickbacks for vendor referrals. I could have released the evidence. I could have cleared my name. But I didn't. Because I wasn't fighting for public opinion. I was fighting for my peace. Still, the cost was steep. My younger son, Malcolm, who had always been more reserved, finally reached out. He came by the house, looking unsure, hands in his coat pockets. "Dad," he said softly, "people are talking. At church, online. They're saying you ruined her." I nodded, not defensive, not angry, just tired. "Let them," I said. "They weren't here. They don't know what she did." Malcolm frowned. "I believe you. But this, Raymond thinks you're trying to erase her." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said. "She erased herself. I just stopped pretending it didn't happen." It was the first time in years Malcolm stood by me. "I never liked her," he admitted, sitting down slowly. "She always looked at people like they were beneath her. Especially you." But I didn't say anything because I thought it would make things worse. I reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, silence is its own kind of betrayal." He nodded slowly. And in that moment, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in days: relief. Someone saw it. Someone understood. But not everyone did. Raymond called again the next night, this time late. The kind of late that suggests he'd been drinking. When I answered, he didn't say hello. He just started talking. "You think this is over?" he slurred. "You think you've won?" "I didn't win anything," I said quietly. "I just ended something that never should have started. She's crying, Gerald. She's scared. We have nothing. Nowhere to go. You had everything," I said, my voice sharp now. "And you threw it away to protect someone who never respected what she was given. She's my wife." He shouted. "And you're supposed to be my father." I said. "But you made your choice." His voice dropped to a growl. "If you don't fix this, if you don't call them and get her job back, you're dead to me." I didn't flinch. "Then bury me." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. But then I heard it, his breath, slow and angry. "You'll die alone," he spat, and hung up. For a few seconds, I just sat there, the phone still in my hand. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't shaking. I was just hollow. There's something surreal about being threatened by your own child. A boy you fed, clothed, protected. A boy whose scraped knees you bandaged, and whose monsters you chased out from under the bed. I thought about all the times I paid his rent, helped him with job referrals, co-signed his first car loan. None of it mattered now. All of it had been rewritten by this one act of defiance. I hadn't betrayed him. I just stopped betraying myself. Miriam didn't say much that night. She sat beside me on the couch and rested her hand on mine. "You did what you had to do," she said. "Even if no one else sees it, I do." I turned to her, weary. "Do you think I went too far?" She paused. "I think you finally told the truth. And sometimes, truth scorches everything in its path." I nodded. She was right. The truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it burns. But I'd take fire over rot any day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house, wondering how we got here. Was it one decision? One marriage? Or was it the accumulation of 1,000 little compromises I made in the name of keeping peace? And if so, what does it mean when keeping peace turns into self-erasure? The thing about family is, it doesn't fracture all at once. It splinters, slowly, invisibly, until one day, you realize the floor beneath you is more cracked than wood. After Bianca's termination and Raymond's exile, the fault lines beneath us widened into a canyon. At first, it was quiet. Just a few canceled brunches, a skipped birthday, the group chat going unusually still. Then came the side conversations, the whispers, the lingering stares at Sunday service. Word had spread, and in true family fashion, no one asked me directly. They asked each other, as if the story would grow truer the more it got passed around. Miriam tried to act as though it didn't bother her, but I saw it in the way she lingered near her phone after dinner, waiting for a text from her sister that never came. I saw it when she dressed for church with less effort than usual, wearing the same dark sweater 2 weeks in a row. My wife had always been the family's quiet diplomat, never confrontational, never dramatic. But even she couldn't ignore the air turning stale around us. At church, we used to sit in the third pew. Now we sat in the back. Nobody said anything, but we felt the space around us grow wider. Where there had once been nods and warm smiles, there was avoidance. Avoidance said more than words ever could. The family group chat finally broke when my eldest daughter, Cheryl, posted a message that read, "I'm not picking sides, but respect goes both ways." It sounded neutral, but I knew what it meant. It meant she was tired of the tension, tired of the silence and the awkward holidays. And I didn't blame her. She had 2 daughters of her own, and every family event now felt like walking into a minefield. I didn't respond, and neither did Raymond. He'd gone silent, digitally and otherwise. But Bianca? Bianca was active, posting vague quotes about betrayal, loyalty, and being stabbed in the back. She was curating her victimhood like an art form. Still, not everyone turned away. Malcolm came over more frequently, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to sit in silence. He didn't say much, but he was there, and that counted. One afternoon, he brought his wife, Naomi, who hadn't visited in months. After some awkward small talk, she finally turned to me and said, "I just want to say, I admire you. I don't think I could have done what you did." Miriam stiffened slightly, unsure whether it was a compliment or a condemnation. But I knew. Naomi had seen Bianca's arrogance up close. She'd been snubbed and talked down to during holidays like the rest of us. Her praise was quiet validation. Later that night, I asked Miriam if she regretted any of it. "Regret what?" she asked, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Letting it go this far. Not stepping in earlier. Letting them treat us the way they did." She looked at me, eyes soft but tired. "I think we both waited too long. But no, I don't regret the end. Just the parts we let slip through the cracks before it got here. That stuck with me. The tragedy wasn't in the explosion. It was in everything we ignored leading up to it. The dinners where Raymond chose silence over support. The holidays where Bianca's words cut and no one bled. We were all complicit in the delay, hoping it would get better with time, as if dysfunction ages into wisdom. It doesn't. It just hardens into habit. A week later, Cheryl came by. She asked to speak privately, without Miriam. "I need to ask you something," she said, sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch. "If this had been me, if it were my husband who disrespected you, would you have done the same?" Her question pierced deeper than I expected. I paused. "If your husband made it his mission to tear me down publicly while living off my resources, and you stood by, then yes, I would." She blinked, nodded slowly. "Okay." She stood to leave, but paused at the door. "You don't have to apologize to everyone. But don't be surprised if not everyone comes back." "I'm not expecting them to," I said. "But I'm done apologizing for having limits." After she left, I sat on the couch for a long time, watching the shadows stretch across the living room. It was hard to know what hurt more, the silence from Raymond or the careful diplomacy from the others. No one said outright that I was wrong, but very few said I was right either. That's the thing about setting boundaries. You don't just lose the ones who crossed them. You lose the ones who stood by while it happened. I began writing letters that week. Not to send, just to get the words out. One to Raymond, where I poured out everything I hadn't said in years. One to Bianca, though hers was far shorter. One to my younger self, apologizing for letting it go on for so long. It felt futile at first, like scratching a scar. But eventually, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not closure. Just clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. This was about reclaiming space in my own story. For too long, I'd been the background character in a narrative written by people who didn't care if I drowned under their dialogue. The family divide was real now. It wasn't speculation anymore. Birthdays were split. Holidays became negotiation tables. And I had no illusions that time alone would fix it. I knew what they were hoping for, that I would eventually cave, reach out, make amends. But I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. I had spent enough years in performance. Now, I was living in truth. And sometimes, the truth is a lonely place. I hadn't seen her in over 3 weeks. Not in person, not in passing, not even in a photograph. And yet her presence lingered, on every strained phone call, every cautious family interaction, every shift in tone when someone mentioned Raymond. Bianca had become a shadow that stretched across our lives without ever stepping back into the room. I thought she'd stay gone, licking her wounds in some rented condo, feeding off online pity while Raymond tried to pick up the pieces. But then, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, as the clouds gathered for rain and I was halfway through my 3rd chapter of a new novel, the doorbell rang. And there she was. She didn't look how I remembered her. She looked human. No makeup, no blazer, just a gray hoodie and sweatpants, and hair pulled into a rushed ponytail. No SUV in the driveway. No manicured nails clutching a phone. Just Bianca, stripped of the armor she had always worn like royalty. I didn't say a word. I just opened the door and waited. "I need to talk," she said, eyes darting everywhere but mine. I let her in. Not out of kindness, out of curiosity. She stepped carefully across the threshold, like she wasn't sure the floor wouldn't collapse beneath her. The living room looked the same, but I could feel how small it must have felt to her now. She sat on the edge of the sofa like it might bite. "Raymond doesn't know I'm here," she started. "And I'm not here to beg." "Then why are you here?" She took a long breath. "Because you won. And I figured you'd want to see what that looks like." I tilted my head. "You think this was about winning? Wasn't it?" Her voice was brittle. "You humiliated me. Took everything from me. The house, the car, my job." "No," I interrupted. "I didn't take anything. You lost those things because you were living on borrowed time in a world you didn't earn. And now you're angry the lender came to collect." She flinched, but didn't argue. That surprised me. "I made mistakes," she said. "I got comfortable. Arrogant. I thought you were just a quiet old man who needed to stay out of the way. I didn't know who you were. I didn't care." "That much was clear," I said. "But I do now. And it terrifies me." That caught me off guard. Not the words, but the honesty. Bianca, for all her theatrics, had never been one to admit fear. She wielded power like a sword. And now she sat across from me, disarmed. "I've been staying with a friend," she said. "Raymond is sleeping on couches, calling in favors. We're broke." The sympathy dried up fast. Turns out people don't want to be near mess they can't fix. I didn't feel pity, but I felt something close to recognition. She stared at the floor. "I'm not here for the job. I know that's gone. I'm not even here to make you feel bad. I needed to say it out loud. You were right. I built a kingdom on favors and ego, and it collapsed the minute someone told the truth." I leaned back in my chair. "So what now?" She finally looked me in the eye. "Now, I get to live with it." She stood slowly, like the act of being upright required effort. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought maybe if you saw me like this, you'd know I'm not some cartoon villain. I was wrong, and I'm paying for it. Every day." I nodded once. "I don't hate you, Bianca. I never did. But I also don't owe you comfort." "I know." She walked to the door, then paused. "You think Raymond will ever talk to you again?" I hesitated. "Maybe. Maybe not. That's his decision. But I won't chase him." She nodded, opened the door, and left. The house felt colder after she was gone. I sat in the silence, not triumphant, not vindicated. Just still. I didn't regret my actions. But there was no pleasure in her pain. I hadn't wanted her to crumble. I'd wanted her to learn. Whether she had or not, time would tell. But for the first time since this all began, I saw her not as a threat, but as a consequence. The living embodiment of what happens when we raise people with power and forget to teach them humility. That evening, I found the letter I had written to Raymond and reread it. I didn't change a word, but I folded it more carefully this time. Because despite everything, there was still a father somewhere in me. Not a fool, not a doormat, but a man who had loved his son once. And might again, if life made space for it. But until then, I would keep my door closed. Not locked, just closed. The hardest part of reclaiming your dignity isn't the confrontation. It's the aftermath, the silence that settles in when the drama fades and the world moves on. It's in the empty chairs at your table, the unanswered texts, the birthdays that pass without calls. No one prepares you for the quiet that comes after you draw a line in the sand. People call it peace, and in many ways it is, but at first, it feels like grief. I spent the weeks that followed Bianca's visit in a state of deep recalibration. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped expecting family to show up like they used to. The truth was, they weren't showing up before either, not really. They were just physically present, masks on, agendas tucked behind small talk. Now, at least, the distance was honest. I'd rather sit in a room alone with the truth than surrounded by people faking connection. There's a freedom in that, once you stop mourning the illusion. Miriam adjusted in her own way. She no longer asked if I'd heard from Raymond. She just moved around the house a little slower, kept her grief tucked into small rituals, rearranging the pantry, humming hymns while folding laundry, setting 2 extra places at dinner out of muscle memory. She never blamed me. In fact, one night, as we sat side by side in bed, reading under warm light, she turned to me and said, "I married you because you were strong." It took me this long to remember that strength isn't always loud. I reached for her hand, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to justify myself. Cheryl came around less, and when she did, she came alone. She never said Raymond's name again, as if it had become something fragile that might shatter if spoken. Malcolm remained steady. He brought over the girls on Sundays, and they filled the house with laughter like it hadn't heard in months. I'd sit on the porch with him while the kids played in the yard, and we'd talk about everything except the thing that hurt. Sometimes, healing sounds like baseball stats and weather forecasts. One morning, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. From Raymond. It wasn't long. Just a folded page with stiff handwriting that read, "I don't understand you." I don't know if I ever did, but I'm starting to wonder if that's on me. That was it. No apology. No invitation. But it was something. A crack in the door I'd thought would stay shut forever. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Not yet. Sometimes space is the message. Sometimes silence is mercy. Bianca never posted about me again. Her social media turned quiet, almost introspective. She had found a job again, less glamorous, less high-ranking, but honest work. I knew because I still had eyes everywhere, even if I no longer used them with intent. This wasn't about watching her fall anymore. It was about letting go. She had been a mirror for everything I had let slide in the name of keeping peace. But the war had ended, and I had no interest in walking the battlefield again. There's a strange freedom in being misunderstood. It no longer offends me. I used to exhaust myself trying to explain my actions to people who never bothered to ask about my reasons. Now I let them think what they want. The ones who matter will see in time. The ones who don't, I'm done carrying their judgment like it's rent for space I no longer occupy. I still sit in my study most mornings, same chair, same window view. But the air feels different. It's lighter. The house no longer echoes with tension. Just quiet. Honest quiet. The kind you earn. I've thought a lot about legacy lately. Not the kind printed on checks or carved into plaques, but the kind that lives in memory. I don't know how I'll be remembered. Maybe as the father who drew a line too late. Maybe as the man who chose dignity over diplomacy. I'm okay with either. Because for the first time, I didn't let fear write the final chapter. I didn't reclaim my name to be praised. I reclaimed it to be at peace. And if that peace came at the cost of proximity, so be it. Family isn't defined by obligation. It's defined by reciprocity, respect, and truth. I gave mine the opportunity to walk with me in that truth. Some did, some didn't. But I'll never regret the moment I chose myself. I spent decades thinking strength meant endurance. Now I know it means limits. And I have found mine. If this story struck a chord with you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, let us know your turning point. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that speak the truth behind the smiles, the tension beneath the traditions, and the courage it takes to finally stand up. Share this if you know someone who needs to hear they're not alone in choosing peace over pleasing others. See you soon in the next story.